everybody, Misty Trick here, explaining how to write expressions when you have cubes that are not full unit cubes. So we'll look at this example, and it says which expression, but instead of choosing expressions, we're actually going to write an expression. So it says, in the figure, each small cube has edges that are a third yard long. Which expression can be used to find the volume of a rectangular prism in cubic yards? So instead, like I said, instead of choosing one, we're going to write one. Now, first of all, it's a good idea to just count how many cubes do we have. And if we count going this way, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 going that way. So I'm going to write that number down. Going this way, which we might call the width, we have 3 as the width. And we have 3 going up as the height. Now, if we were interested in how many cubes we have, how many of the third edge cubes we have, then we would multiply this together and we would have a number, and that would be how many cubes. But that's not what they're asking. They want to know cubic yards. Now, if we think about volume as being cubic, right? If we take this number and cube it, that means a third times a third times a third. So if we're looking for an expression, this is an expression that could be used to find how many cubic yards. We can also replace this with multiplying by a third cubed. Or we could even replace it with what it's equal to, which if we actually find what all these green numbers are equal to, it's equal to 1/27th. And we've talked about that ratio, that 1 to 27 ratio. For every full cube, you have 27 third cubes. Now, let's take a look at the picture and make sense why this expression works. Now, if we just count out our thirds, this is 1/3, this would be 2/3, this would be 3/3, this would be 4/3. So that is really 4/3 of a yard in length, that red line that I just drew, even though it wasn't very straight. Now, did you know that if we took 4 and multiplied it by a third, we would get this number? So as a matter of fact, let's write it down again. All right. Now, if we count going back this way with thirds, we have 1/3, we have 2/3, we have 3/3. Now, you all know 3/3, that's equal to 1, right? So I'm just going to put it as a 1 over here. But did you know that if I did 3 times a third, I would get 1? How about counting up? 1/3, 2/3, 3/3. So that's also equal to 1. 3/3, that's equal to 1. It's 1 yard, right? 1 yard. So we have 4/3 of a yard, we have 1 yard, and we have 1 yard. And if we want to know how many cubic yards, we would have to multiply these red numbers together, and that'll give us the answer. Which, by the way, let's go back and make sure everybody understands that when we counted out 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, that's basically the same thing as doing this times this. This times this gives us 1. So one way we could find the answer is to just go right across and multiply all these numbers together, but we could also multiply these red numbers together and get the answer. So if we multiply 4 times 1 times 1, we're going to get 4, and the denominator is going to be 3. And if I rename that as a mixed number, it's going to go in once with 1 left over. So we're going to have 1 1/3 cubic yards. Now again, if we multiply just the blue numbers together, what would be the unit on that? If we were to multiply 4 times 3 times 3, which would be the same thing as doing 9 times 4, which is 36, we would have 36 cubes that are a third edge cubes. So you would say I have 36 1/3 yard edge cubes. If you need to find cubic yards, that's a different number, isn't it? All right, now what if, let's look at another example. Let's look at, actually this one I kind of like. Oh, I should mention this too. Let's go back to this for just a second. If this number had been changed to, instead of a third, let's say it had been a half, then did you know that the denominators here would just get changed to a 2? You would change this to a 2, this to a 2, and this to a 2, and then you would obviously have different numbers here. So we'll explore that with some other examples in just a moment, but let's look at this example, and we'll stick with thirds, because usually for 6th grade math, what fractions are you likely to see? I've seen a half, I've seen a third, I've seen a fourth, and occasionally I've seen a fifth, but I've never seen anything a sixth or a fraction smaller than that. So that's what you can probably expect to see on most of the questions that you'll come across as a sixth grader. But let's practice this idea of writing expressions, but this time for what we see here. So same thing. This is exactly the same thing. We have the 1/3 yard long for each. So that line that I just drew, for example, is 1/3 yard long. And we want to find or write an expression if we're interested in how many cubic yards. So once again, we can just count the cubes. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cubes going that way. We have 1, 2, 3 cubes going that way. And we have 1, 2 cubes going that way. All right, now remember, volume is cubic. So if we cube this, if we cube that, we can multiply this blue expression with this. That would work. But we can also just think of it as the separate factors. 1/3 times 1/3 times 1/3. And by the way, just want to remind you all that this, if we actually found out what this equals, is equal to 1/27. So I could also replace everything that I have here in red and just put, times 1/27, and that would work. All right, but let's actually try to wrap our heads around why this expression works. If we count out the thirds, let's count them out. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, 4/3, 5/3. That's 5/3 of a yard. I'm going to write that number down here. Now, did you know that that's what we would get if we multiplied this times this? Going back, 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, 3/3. That's what I would get if I multiplied this times this, which, by the way, you know that that's equal to 1, right? So why not use the more user-friendly version of that number? All right, and then going up, if we count in thirds, 1/3, 2/3. If we did this times this, we would also get 2/3. All right, so if we finish this up to find how many cubic yards we're talking about, we would multiply these green numbers together, not the blue numbers together, because that would be how many cubes that we have that are this size. We need to multiply these numbers together. So if we do, and by the way, if it helps to stick a 1 underneath there, you could, but it really doesn't matter. 5 times 1 times 2 would be 10. And then if we multiply 3 times 1 times 3, that would be 9. And this would rename as 1 1/9. So it would be 1 1/9 cubic yards would be our answer here. Now let's change this same thing up, but let's just replace. What if we change this number, instead of being a third, let's change it to being a half a yard. A half a yard. And let's ask ourselves, what would we be doing differently if instead of it being a third, it was a half? So we would still be dealing with the same cubes going across, right? The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going that way, the 3 going this way, and the 2 going this way. But instead of putting in a third, we would say to ourselves, what's the equivalent of this thing cubed, right? And we would say to ourselves, it would be a half times a half times a half. Volume is 3-dimensional. You have length, you have width, and you have height. So you need to have all the dimensions covered in this case. All right, now let's make sense of this expression that we just wrote and why it would work to find how many cubic yards. If we actually counted out our half units, right? 1 half unit at a time. 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves. So if we did this times this, we would get this number. So I'm going to write this number down here so that we have it for computation. Going back, if we count in halves, we have 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves. 3 halves. It's not an accident that if we did this number times this, we would get this. So let's put it in our workspace. All right, and then finally, if we count going up, 1 half, 2 halves. You all know that 2 halves is equal to 1, right? So why not we can put 2 halves in there, but it's probably going to be easier if we just put it as 1. All right, so if we want to know how many cubic yards and each edge is a half inch, or I'm sorry, half yard, then we just multiply these blue numbers together, and that will give us how many cubic yards. So let's go across. 5 times 3 is 15. 2 times 2 is 4. And if I multiplied the product of these two with 1, these two factors rather, with 1, I would still get this. And if we needed to rename that as a mixed number, let's take a look at what that would look like. 15 divided by 4, it's always the numerator divided by the denominator. Wouldn't that go in 3 times? Wouldn't we get 12? Wouldn't there be 3 left over? So it would be 3 and 3/4. This is equal to 3 and 3/4 cubic yards. So we would put down the appropriate unit. Now, I just want to review with you for a second. What if I had to put a unit? If I did 5 times 3 times 2, I would get 30. What would the unit be on that? It would be 30 of the half inch or half yard cubes. That's a different unit than this. This is cubic yards. Much different answer. All right, so let's look at one more, and then I think we'll kind of get the hang of this. How about we look at one like this? And let's stick with the 1/3. Actually, you know what? Let's change it to a fourth. Let's do that. Let's change it to, we're going to go with 1/4. And instead of yards, let's do meters. All right, so this time they don't actually show us the cubes, they just put it on the grid paper. But you can see that it's a little bit small, but I'll tell you what the numbers are. So this number here is 8. This number is a 5. And this number is a 3. All right, so if we're changing the length of that line to being a 1/4 meter, 1/4 of a meter, then that means that what do we have to include in with this? We have to include in the equivalent of this being cubed, which is the same as 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4. Now, let's talk about other equivalents of 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4. If you wanted to replace all this green stuff with what 1/4 cubed is, 1/4 cubed, that's equal to 1/64. Because remember, 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. So 1/4 cubed is equal to 1/64. If you replace all of this with this, that would also give you the answer. All right, so now let's talk about what's next if you actually have to find how many cubic meters are in this thing. So we can count out how many fourths there are. So we could say to ourselves 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4, 6/4, 7/4, 8/4. So basically, what are you doing? You're taking the number that's given here and you're just sticking a 4 underneath it. All right, so I'm going to write that number down here, 8/4. Actually, no, let's do this. Let's simplify that. You know that that's equal to 2, right? So rather than putting it as 8/4, let's just put what its simplified version is, which is 2. All right, so that's doing this times this and getting this. All right, now going up, if we just take that number 5 and say to ourselves, we're breaking this thing up into fourths, we can count, see, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4. That's the same thing as doing this times this. And then finally, this way, you really can't count it because it's at the diagonal there, but this would be 3, right? 3 times 1/4, which would be 3/4. So we just did this and multiplied it by that, and we end up with this. All right, now if we're going to find out what all this equals because we want cubic meters, then we would go across, and if it makes you feel better, we can stick a 1 underneath this to keep things neat and tidy. And we might even consider reducing, like how about we divide by 2 and divide by 2 to make our numbers a little more user-friendly. So if we do 1 times 5 times 3, we get 15. And if we do 1 times 2 times 4, we get 8. And if we have to find the mixed number equivalent of that, and we do 15 divided by 8, it's going to go in that one time with the 7 left over, so that would be equal to 1 7/8. Let's write it again over here. 1 7/8 cubic, I think we said meters, right? Cubic meters. So we would put a little m with an exponent of 3, or we would write the word cubic in front of the word meters, or the symbol for meters, and that would be okay also. All right, so hopefully you get the hang of it. Whatever fraction they give you right here, just remember you have to cube it. And to get the answer, you can, if you're not understanding all this stuff that I drew in the picture, if you just simply multiply all the numbers together in any order that you want, because you can just do 8 times 5 times 3, which would be 120, and then multiply that by what this is equal to, which is 1/64th, you're still going to get the 1 7/8 as your simplified answer.